Welcome back to the Point in Lansing. At any given time, there is always a lot of legislation that's being considered, and it's not always stuff that you hear about because not every single bill gets reported on. That's why from time to time, we try to seek out representatives to find out what's on their mind. That's what we did this past week with Democratic Representative Brian Elder from Bay City. Representative, in a body of 110, you deal with a lot of different issues, and sometimes they aren't all at the forefront. For example, we've heard a lot of conversation about auto no-fault insurance, but you have other issues that you're interested in. One of them has to do with a partial way that schools are funded. Talk to me a little bit about that funding source and what your concerns are.
Okay. Right now in the state of Michigan, there are 6 ISDs, which are usually run at the county level, that have what are called enhancement millages. Now, these are millages that the voters have voted on to give their local public schools a little bit extra money. And those monies are primarily for operational costs. So that might be upgrading technology. It might be hiring additional teachers to make sure that class size stays low. It might be bricks and mortar type issues to deal with infrastructure. So right now there is a proposal that comes from the state Senate to allow charter schools to tap into those funds. And that's problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, when we opened the door to our charter school regime, the charter school industry promised that they would never seek these types of monies, that they were free market based and they didn't need any additional money and they could compete just fine. Well, what we've found is that over the last 15 years, there's probably an additional 250 or more charter schools in the state of Michigan. 80% of those are private, for-profit corporations. Oftentimes the corporations are not from here in Michigan, and they're running their schools for a profit line. Okay. The problem is that we have not increased the pie for public education in the state of Michigan. Instead, we've just added 250 more people to the dinner table. So the public schools are having some problems, but the charter schools are having problems also. And they're not doing too well, and that's why they're trying to chase down this additional money. One of the problems that really bothers me is we have a lot of cyber schools in the state of Michigan, and enhancement money, if it's intended to reduce class size, well, that's not relevant to a cyber school. That's not a problem they have. And if the money is intended for technological upgrades, to make sure that the rooms are Wi-Fi connected, or if the plumbing needs to be fixed, or the ceilings have a problem. None of those issues are relevant to cyber schools, but they would be able to tap into these funds also. And I think that's wrong.
When you think about charter schools, I mean, there are charter schools that operate within a school district. Sometimes they have some connection to,
sometimes,
and sometimes they are in addition to, or a specialty school and that type of thing. And not speaking of cyber schools, because that's a little bit different, but they do have brick and mortar issues, and they do have classrooms and all of those kind of things. But you still believe that this particular funding source for those ISDs who have gone out and convinced the folks to vote for that enhancement, that those should be only for traditional public schools.
That's exactly right. The problem is we're not going to increase the amount of money available in these enhancement millages. So every single dollar that is transferred to a charter school, which had promised not to ask for this money, is necessarily a dollar that's not going to go to the public school. And that means you have another year where they can't get the class size down in first grade. It's another year where they're going to have to deal with some ceiling tiles that have problems. Another year where the technology is going to be outdated. And that's not what the voters in these areas requested.
Still, and not to belabor the point, those students that are going to charter schools are still taxpayers' children, right?
Oh, undoubtedly. And their parents made decisions that, for their own personal reasons, that they wanted to take their kids and put them in a for-profit school. And they're free to make that choice. But once you make that choice, it comes with some consequences, one of which is this funding source is not available to you, and it was never available to you.
When you look at charter schools overall and look at the impact that they've had. And I know education, given your background as an attorney, we were talking just earlier, so you understand the importance of that education system. How are we doing there when you say we haven't expanded the pie for these districts, but inviting more people to the table? What has the development of charter schools done to our educational system and to our funding?
The charter school regime that we have in the state of Michigan is unique nationwide. It's almost like the wild, wild west. Almost anybody can get certified. There's almost no transparency in how these schools are operated, and it has been a definite detriment to the traditional public school system. And when you have a charter school, you can have a good charter school operator. They can be doing a good job. But if someone sets up a franchise across the street, suddenly they can be competing with another school that doesn't have any kind of accountability, can maybe cherry pick their kids, and you have this cycle, this rush to the bottom. And it has had a very serious negative impact on how we do things in the state of Michigan, especially because we've had such a spike in the number of charter schools, and we have not increased the amount of public school funding over the last 15 years.
What is, if that is the problem from your perspective, what is the answer to that?
Well, I think the promise that was made originally is that these charter schools would operate like public schools, but have a different business model. So if they're taxpayer funded, then they should have to do all of the things that a public school does. They should be covered more strongly under the Open Meetings Act, so citizens can go and see how things are actually operated. We should have access to all of their documents and records under the Freedom of Information Act in the same way that you do in a public school. And that way the average citizen can hold these schools accountable. And when they do that, some charter schools will be stars. They'll be good operations. But then the bad apples, they'll be scurrying in the sunlight.
I want to change the subject a little bit. Recently, Democrats have started talking about, I think it's a pretty big package of legislation that would, they believe, stop what they call wage theft. First of all, what is wage theft?
Wage theft can take a number of aspects. Probably the most common is when employees in the food service industry have their tips held back from them by employers. Or if they're forced to work past their shift, but they're not paid overtime. And in some places where they're simply forced to work off the clock. And the employees in this sector are predominantly women, and they're predominantly poor. And these are non-unionized workforces. So these employees are easy to take advantage of if the employer is a bad actor. And the unfortunate thing is most employers are not this way. But the bad actors, they get this unfair advantage when they steal workers' money. And if you have a good local restaurant right down on Main Street and they're doing everything the right way, they shouldn't have to compete with these bad actors. And what happens to the employees? Well, these are people who are doing everything the right way, right? We want them to work, and they're working. And they're trying to take care of things on their own, and they're not asking for handouts. And then if they happen to be stuck in a situation where they need a job, how do they defend themselves against a bad employer? I think the only way to address this issue, and it's a rampant problem, is to make sure there are laws in place that stop the bad actors. And so that's why we've introduced a series of bills that have very serious consequences for any of these bad employers. You can actually face jail time if you've stolen enough money. You can have fines up to $10,000. And I think with those kinds of problems or those kinds of solutions in place, then those bad actors are going to stop acting bad. And then people who are doing the right thing, trying to take care of themselves, trying to provide for their families, they're going to be protected.
There'll be people sitting at home this morning watching this that'll say, well, why wouldn't they just walk away? But the fact is that some of these folks you talk about can't afford to walk away from that particular job, and that's how these employers can take advantage of it.
That's exactly right. So if you've got a single working mother, maybe this is the job she has because it fits her calendar during the day, and she's getting her kids to school, and she's got to be home when they get home from school, and she's doing everything that we would want a mom to do, and she's only got a certain amount of time where she can work. Well, if she's especially in a small town, there might not be a lot of other places for her to work, and it's wrong to take advantage of somebody in that situation.
And it could be a transportation issue. It might be nearby, and there might not be adequate transportation. So these measures, and we won't go through all of them because there are a number of them, but as you say, they come with some pretty stringent penalties that go along with them. And I know it was your caucus, your fellow caucus members that introduced them. Have you gotten any feedback from the majority side of the aisle?
Not yet, but I'll tell you this. One of the things that people believe is that the two parties are always fighting with each other, and that's not really the case. Many of us have very good relationships across the aisle, and there are good folks in the Republican caucus who also think it would be wrong to take advantage of a working mother. So we're hoping to have hearings on these bills, and we're hoping to pass them into legislation.
The bill that Representative Elder talked about that would change where some of the education money goes was on the schedule for this past week in Lansing, but it was removed. We don't know when or if it will come back up, but it's something we'll continue to watch. And we'll be back with more To the Point.